Welcome back to lesson 17 in our series on learning Python for beginners. In this presentation, you'll learn how to accumulate a total or sum from a series of numbers using a loop structure. In this lesson, we'll briefly recap what we've learned about loops. We'll learn how to use a for loop, a counter-controlled loop, to add up a total. We'll learn how to use a while loop, a conditional loop, to add up a total, and we'll think about how we can improve the user experience. So let's quickly recap what we've learned about counter-controlled loops. They start with the keyword for, they have a counter variable and a range, and they will count up to the top of that range. If you can't remember about counter-controlled loops, go back and have a look at lesson 15. We can use a counter-controlled loop to add together a group of numbers. We begin by setting the total to 0. Do this before the start of the loop. Inside the loop, the user enters a value. Remember, input values are strings, so we'll convert it to an integer and then add it to the total. That's the command total equals total plus value. That will take the value of the total, add the input value to it, and store the answer back into the total variable. When the loop is finished, we can print out the total. This loop will repeat exactly 10 times. So we've decided before we write the program that exactly 10 values will be input. So now you try this, pause the video and have a go. Make this change, get the user to input the number of values that you want to add together, loop that number of times and accumulate the values to give a total, and then output the total on the screen at the end. If you can make that work, then that shows that you've understood how to create a total using a counter-controlled loop. We can also create a total using a condition-controlled loop. Condition-controlled loops begin with the keyword while, and they're controlled by a test. As long as the test is true, the loop will repeat. This is an example of a password program from the last lesson. We can use a condition-controlled loop to add up a total, just like a counter-controlled loop. And you'll see that many of the lines are exactly the same as the previous example. We're setting a total to 0 before the loop begins, and inside the loop, the user is entering a number value, we're converting it to an integer and adding it to the total. At the bottom of the program, we print out the total. All those lines are exactly the same as the counter-controlled loop. But what's different? Well, in the header of the loop, we're using a logical test. And in this example, we're using a variable called more, and we're testing whether it has the value uppercase Y. Before the loop begins, we have to give that variable a value. And in this example, we've given it the value uppercase Y, so we can be certain that the loop will repeat at least once. And inside the loop, we're giving the user the chance to alter the value of the variable more. And that means each time round the loop, we ask them if they want to add more numbers to the total. As long as they keep typing Y, then the loop will repeat. The difference between a condition-controlled loop and a counter-controlled loop is that the user has control over the number of iterations. Instead of setting the value before the loop begins, each time round the user has the chance to say whether they want to continue or not. And this makes the program more flexible. So using a condition-controlled loop has quite a lot of advantages for the user. It gives them greater control over how many times the loop repeats. The disadvantage is that it can be extra work for them, twice as much typing. Here's a possible solution. In the header of the loop, the variable that we're using is the number entered by the user. The user only has to enter one thing, a number, but they have control over how many times the loop repeats, because when they enter the number 0, the loop will stop. In order to make this work, we've got to give them the chance to enter the number before the loop begins. That's so that the logical test will have something to compare to 0. And that means that we have to set the total at the top of the loop so that the very first number that they have entered will be added to the total, and then the input comes below that. So let's recap what we've learned. We have to set a total to 0 before the loop. We have to add to the total during the loop, and we have to output the result after the loop. We've seen how to do that with a counter-controlled loop, where we know exactly how many numbers we're going to enter in advance, or with a condition-controlled loop, where the user has control over how many times the loop repeats. And we've looked at a variation of that, where we simplify the exit condition to reduce the amount of typing for the user. So here's an opportunity for you to try out your skills. Create a program, as you've seen in this lesson, that adds up the sum of a series of numbers until the user enters a negative number. Create a program that loops through a series of numbers entered by the user, but only adds numbers if they are odd numbers. So you get the total of all the odd numbers added by the user. And apply your skills about entering and adding up numbers to create a supermarket checkout program where you enter the value of a series of items and then calculate the total cost that the person has to pay. In the next presentation, we'll look at some other ways of applying what we have learned about loops to useful programming topics.